So the primary, we talked about the primary centers. What is another name? There's several options there. So what is another name for a secondary ossification center?
And you can't spell the word.
If you can't say that, as long as it's recognizable, that's okay. Okay, what is another name for a secondary ossification center? All right, second question. Does myelination of the nerve improve speed of impulse transmission or firing down the nerve, or does it increase the amount of information that's transmitted? So does it increase speed when the nerve is myelinated, or does it increase amount? What's the role of myelination? Question 1, what's another name for a secondary ossification center? Question 2, does myelination improve the speed of impulse transmission or firing, or the amount of information? And question number 3, what are the 2 areas of fat distribution? So what are the main 2 areas of fat distribution in the body? And what are the terms for those, for fat distribution in the body?
I can't spell this name.
That's okay, as long as it's understandable. Okay, make sure you've got your name on there.
Fat producers?
Trade-off. Sorry?
Fat producers? What are the 2 fat producers?
No, what are the 2 areas for fat? Where is fat laid down? So what's the distribution of fat? 2 areas of distribution. Okay, trade-off. Make sure you got your name on there. Right, everybody got someone else's? So 1 point for each question. Right. First question, what is another name for a secondary ossification center? So it could be epiphyseal plates. It could be pressure epiphysis. It could be the kind of layman's term would be growth plate, but really you should be looking for epiphyseal plate or pressure epiphysis. And I suspect the spelling may be wrong, but that's okay. So if they've got one of those answers, give them 1 point. All right, question 2, does myelination improve speed of impulse transmission or firing down the nerve, or the amount of information that's transmitted? All right, myelination, adding that fatty sheath, improves the speed of the transmission of the impulse. It allows us to move the impulse much faster down a myelinated nerve than a non-myelinated nerve. Okay, question 3. What are the 2 types of fat, 2 areas of fat distribution? So half a point for each one, okay? The first one is internal or visceral. So around, inside your trunk, around your organs.
What if you put trunk? What if you put trunk? Trunk and then arms.
Half a point.
Solid, I'll take it.
The second one is subcutaneous, so under your skin. That's good. That indicates reading. I'll give you some points for that, because they do talk quite a lot about that in the chapter. All right, so total out of 3. Let's get going. We're going to leave the lights on so that we can stay awake. All right, so we're going to look, chapter 5 is looking at different body systems. All right, so this is information regarding things that would be structural constraints when you're working with an individual. So change in a body system would count as a structural constraint, and therefore any change ought to change the interaction among the constraints and lead to a different kind of movement pattern emerging. So maybe a slightly less effective movement pattern in certain circumstances, and in others a more efficient movement pattern. So again, what we're interested in is what's average, what is typical, right? So that we can recognize a child who's developing typically, and we can also identify someone who is doing something that's a little odd, right? And then what are the variations that would be acceptable as okay? When might we see the system change? How is it going to maybe affect the skill that I'm trying to teach them? Right? What effect would the change have on the movement pattern is what we're interested in. So we mentioned the term rate limiter a week or so ago, so just a reminder that a rate limiter is a system that lags behind in development when we're looking at the younger end of the age spectrum. If we're looking at the older end of the age spectrum, it would be the system that deteriorated first and had an impact on the movement pattern. So, skeletal system would act as a rate limiter for a child learning to stand up. The bones have to be heavy enough and strong enough to stand on. Okay. Adipose system, our fat deposit. We have often see fat deposits as a rate limiter for movement. Right. Children and adults who carry more than typical adipose tissue will have very different movement patterns, especially if we're looking at something where they're supposed to get themselves off the ground. That can be very difficult because of the additional weight that the adipose adds to the body, and it doesn't add any functional capacity, right? It's not like muscle weight. If I put on muscle, I put on weight, but that muscle makes me stronger and more powerful, so I'm able to lift that weight easier. So, skeleton first, right? When we looked at the prenatal end first, we said that the primary ossification center, we see those around 8 weeks. So this jelly baby has a cartilage outline. And at around 8 weeks, we start to see those little dark shadows in the center of the long bones. And they start to lay down bone cells from the middle. And by the time the baby's born, the whole length of the bone should be ossified. Once we're born, we see something slightly different occurring, because now if we're looking at a long bone, it doesn't grow from the center out anymore. It starts to grow at the ends, and it adds extra cells on at the ends to increase the length. Right? So I'm really bad at drawing this, but what we see is a long bone right? And we get a line of cartilage and different tissue right here at the neck. And that's where my new bone cells get laid down, and that lengthens the shaft of the long bone. So this is my growth plate, epiphyseal plate, pressure epiphyses. If I apply more pressure, then we see, so on weight-bearing bones, we see more bone being laid down there. Now, we don't want this bone to get long, 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 long and skinny, so there's also a mechanism to make it fatter. Okay? And when we're laying bone cells down on the edges, on the outside here, and making it fatter, that's called appositional growth. Okay? And that's important because it makes the bones denser and heavier. But when we're working in movement, this growth plate is key, because we can damage that if we do something wrong, and then that's a major piece of surgery to put that right. And if for some reason they couldn't put it right, then someone would end up with an arm or a leg that was shorter than the other one. Okay. So we have to take really good care of this epiphyseal plate. So the growth, the laying down of cells at that plate stops at different times with different long bones. So my arms stop growing at a different time to my legs, my toes stop growing at a different time to my legs, my fingers might stop sooner or later than my arms, typically a little bit later because of our laws of direction. Right? I'm going from the midline out, proximo-distal. And typically all your long bones are going to be shut by around 18 or 19. Okay? And we see that closure of the plate earlier in girls than in boys. And that's because closure of the plate is connected to release of sex hormones during puberty. So because girls go into puberty earlier and are releasing estrogen at a rapid rate, their epiphyseal plate shuts down sooner. Right? Well, as soon as it's shut, once this is not an epiphyseal plate now, then that bone is done growing, at least lengthwise. I can still lay down cells around the periphery of the bone and make the bone thicker, but it's not going to grow anymore. So individuals who go into puberty early see a rapid growth, but they also see those epiphyseal plates shut down sooner. So it's important if you're working with that age group, because you can literally slide that plate off the end of the bone or crack it. Right? You can damage the blood supply to the plate and impact growth of the bone. So in gymnastics, that's an injury that you see sometimes because you're working with them pre-puberty, before these things are shut, and early in puberty. In sports where they're not really starting until they're older, less of an issue. There's also what we call a traction epiphyses. And the traction epiphyses is the point where the tendon for a muscle attaches to the bone. And so when you look at a skeleton, you can tell whether the skeleton was right or left-handed, for example. Right? Was that person right or left-handed? Were the hand, the arm that has the larger traction epiphyses, when you look at the bone, is the one that had the most stress on it, and therefore gives you an indication whether they were right or left-handed. So that's really cool when you're looking at bones. The more pressure, it's just like training, right? If I stress something, it adapts and we see change. So if we stress the bone, that stimulates the bone to lay down more cells and get stronger. So it's important to do lots of walking and jumping and running and to make the bone as strong as possible. Does that make sense? Some of the bone skeletal type injuries, anybody know anyone that had Osgood-Schlatter's disease? You had it? Right, so Osgood-Schlatter's is a problem at the knee where the tendon, the patellar tendon, attaches to the front of the tibia. Right? So children who are going through growth and they're jumping or running a lot, then you see some damage at that junction where the tendon is attaching to the bone, and it can be pretty painful. Yeah, it can be really painful. So the doctors will say, okay, no more running and jumping. Sometimes they have to resort to putting a teenager or a young child into a cast, because getting them not to run or jump can sometimes be difficult. So if it's a really bad case and it doesn't ease off, then they sometimes will resort to putting them in a cast. Throwers get lots of these kinds of overuse injuries. So when you throw, the torque in the elbow as your hand moves through pulls on the traction epiphyses, and you can get throwing injuries at the elbow because of overuse and force on that elbow. So you've got to take care of the skeleton while it's developing, because some of these problems, if you get them when you're young, they're going to mean that later on it's difficult to be pain-free. That injury doesn't always clear up, or it causes...
Cause arthritis?
It might. We've got a lot to learn. But yeah, I think generally pounding and overuse of the joints can cause arthritis. Yeah, most of us are going to go there. That's okay, it's a trade-off.
Can you get into that or no?
Hmm?
Can you get into that? Because like there's rheumatoid arthritis, which is the worst kind. But is that it? Like normal arthritis is like...
Osteoarthritis is the less...
Is alright.
Yeah.
But the other one is like your bones start reshaping.
Yeah.
So is that like what is it, osteoporosis kind of deal?
No, osteoporosis, we'll look at osteoporosis. This is what osteoporosis does. This would be a healthy piece of bone here. Right? When we have osteoporosis, then we get these gaps in the bone get bigger and bigger, and the amount of bone density gets less. I lay down less calcium or less magnesium, and so the bone gets very brittle and very weak. So that can occur because bone, yes, sir.
Is that like, can you try to treat that from nutrition, or is it mostly from exercise?
I'm hoping so, because I'm in the first stage and I don't know why. So I'm hoping we can do it with nutrition and even more exercise.
But like, which is more important?
Diet or exercise.
I think you have to do, but I don't know that they know which is more important. I think it's a combination is the best strategy. Bone is a tissue that does not stop growing, right? So it seems like it would be a tissue that finishes at a certain point because it's hard, but that isn't what happens. We actually remodel our bones all the time. When you're your age, the bone that I'm laying down here balances the bone that I'm reabsorbing because it's old, and your bones stay healthy and strong. As we get older, the bone that I'm laying down slows down, but I keep absorbing the old bone, and so that's where the problem occurs, because now the balance gets out of whack, and that's when I can start to develop some problems and some thinning in the bone. So the best way to handle it is make sure you have calcium, girls in particular, right? Your diets now need to have plenty of calcium in them so that these bones are as strong as they can be. Your exercise plan should include weight-bearing exercise. So biking and swimming are great activities for heart health, not so good for bone health. For bones, I've got to do weight training, I've got to run or walk, right? Play with the dog, be on my feet, I've got to be yoga, I've got to do stuff where I am holding my weight and stressing the bone to lay down more cells. You want your bones as strong as possible, again, particularly the girls because they are at more risk, but males can develop osteopenia and osteoporosis as well. But you want them as strong as possible before you go into menopause, because in menopause, then we stop releasing estrogen, and estrogen stimulates bones to lay down cells. And so if my bones are thin, and now I don't lay down more bone cells, then we're at risk, right? Individuals who develop eating disorders are often at risk because having a very restricted calcium intake in your diet is going to lead to your bones being thinner than they should be when you hit menopause. Right? So individuals who are watching their diet and cut out milk and cheese and yogurt and ice cream and can be at risk for later on. So we develop osteoporosis. We can develop it in the head of the femur there. It can be in the spinal column. Can be in your arms and your wrists. They check your wrists in particular to make sure that your skeleton is healthy. So generally that structure doesn't change a lot unless we start to develop low bone density. Phase 1 is called osteopenia. That's like pre-osteoporosis. And then if you develop full-blown osteoporosis, you're at quite a big risk. The rib cage can collapse. You can develop fractures in your spinal column, and that spinal column could give way, that particular spine could give way and lead to changes in posture and height. So how much bone loss we see is a combination. We get a interaction between hormone levels in the body, what do I eat, what's my diet, and what kind of exercise do I take. Okay. So if you're working with swimmers, right, you become a strength and conditioning coach for a swim team, it would be really, I think, beneficial for them, for you to encourage them to do some walking and running as well as their swimming. swimming is not weight-bearing exercise. So how can we look at it? How can we tell what's going on? X-rays are really great, and it's interesting when you look at X-rays of younger children, because they have like a whole book with this is what different stages of bone development looks like on an X-ray. So when you look at the one on the left there, that's either a male about 48 months, or remember, girls mature faster than boys, so if it was a female, she would be around 37 months, around 3. So she's nearly a year ahead in her skeletal development to the boy. So if you look at the ends of the long bones, here's the epiphyseal plate. You can see it really well on these fingers. At this age, the bones in the wrist aren't very formed. So round bones just put on bone all the way around and they don't get longer. Here's another epiphyseal plate at the end of the humerus. If you look at this one, this would be a boy of 156 months or a girl of 128 months. So again, the bones show a distinct difference between the boys and the girls. The girls' system matures earlier. But in this one now, you can see, look how the wrist bones are developed, right? Some of these epiphyseal plates look like they're starting to finish off their job. We've still got a couple that are laying down cells, so her fingers haven't stopped growing yet. So if I use an X-ray, it's an interesting, if I've got a child who's 8.5 and we X-ray them and their bones look like someone who is 7, then they're going to be a late maturer. If their bones look like someone who's 9, then they're an early maturer. So if I look across a classroom, if you've got 35 kids in your class and they haven't stopped growing yet, you could have as much as a 2.5 to 3 year range in maturity when we're looking at the skeleton. That's a big thing to take account of if I'm teaching that group, because I might want to do loads of impact work with them. Lots of running, lots of jumping, but if I've got children whose skeletons are very immature versus children whose skeletons are mature, I've got to be careful. Right? You can't assume that everybody's maturity, we said this last week, just because they're all the same chronological age does not mean that all their systems are at the same level. Okay? Chronological age is not maturity. Other questions on the skeleton? All right, what about muscles then, right? Each system develops at its own rate. I don't see maturity in the muscular system at the same time as I see maturity in the skeletal system. We said last week we grow up then out, right? So when I hit puberty, I see faster growth in the skeleton. Legs get long, arms get long. At some point, once I've released enough sex hormone, my legs and arms and fingers and toes are going to stop growing. I might see some change in height because of a change in trunk length. okay? Because the spine is not a long bone, so it keeps growing for a little bit longer than legs and arms. But remember, after that peak height velocity, we've got quite a period of time before we start to see an increase in muscle. So I've got a period of time where skills that I might have been very good at 10 or 11, suddenly maybe get a bit fluffy and hazy as I'm 12 and 13, 14, until my muscle mass catches up with the extra skeleton I've got to move around. Because that skeleton is heavy. Okay, bones are heavy, hopefully. So prenatally, muscle cells grow by hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Okay, so hyperplasia, I'm adding on more muscle cells. Hypertrophy, the muscle cells that I laid down are getting bigger. Once we're born, again we see a change in that pattern. Right? Predominantly, once we're born, change in muscle mass is due to hypertrophy. So we don't lay down a lot of additional muscle cells once we're born. A few, but not a lot. Most of our muscle cells are there when we're born, and then we're just making them bigger. As always, we see our S-shaped curve, right? So even with the muscle growth, we would see an S-shaped, big curve in growth. And muscles can increase in diameter. That's generally related to how much physical activity, how much work they get, so they can get fatter. Okay. And they can increase in length by addition of a sarcomere. So if you haven't done your A&P yet, then the sarcomere is like a little, your muscles are made up of little, or at least skeletal muscles are made up of little building units that look like dominoes end on end. Okay? So I can add another domino on the end, or I can make the domino fatter. Okay? Remember what's going on here. The bone grew first, but the muscle is attached to the bone. So when the bone grows, it tugs on this muscle that hasn't grown yet, and that applies stress to the muscle and encourages the muscle to lay down additional sarcomeres to get longer. Right? So it's often about stressing the system, just like when we're training. If we want to get better, we want to get bigger, we have to stress the system. Okay? So the same thing is going on here. Sometimes that means that we get growing pains. So sometimes kids get aches and pains in their legs and their arms because the bone shoots up and the muscle's too short and it's getting dragged along by this bone, but it hasn't grown itself yet. Right? So growing pains can be the stress on the muscle before it adds additional length. And when we're looking at the muscle system, once we hit adolescence, once we hit puberty, we start to see some big difference between boys and girls, right? Particularly in upper body. So girls lay down pretty good muscle around their legs, their thighs are quite strong. Generally, girls don't put on a lot of muscle across their chest or their back or their shoulders or their arms. Right? So post-puberty, they're not going to be able to keep up. We have to start setting different goals for the girls. They can't throw a ball as far or as hard as a guy can. Not because their muscle is different, just because they don't have as much muscle as a guy. Okay. All right, so when you take exercise physiology, we're going to talk a lot about muscle fiber type, right? Speed.
Speed and slowage.
How fast are you? Right? So right now, we're just going to look at very briefly the idea that there's a difference. I can be slow and keep going for a long time, or I can be fast and fall on my face after a not very long time. Okay? I can't be fast for a long time. Those two things don't go together. So when we look at muscle tissue, we have different kinds of fibers in our muscle that do different jobs. Some of them contract slowly, but they can keep going for ages and ages and ages and ages and ages. Well, that's great if I want to go hiking. Right? Some of them contract very quickly and are very powerful, create force very quickly. That equals power. Right? That allows me to jump off the floor, or sprint very quickly, or throw the ball very fast. Right? But I can't keep that up for any length of time. So a quick, powerful fiber runs out of juice very quickly. A slow, continuous fiber can keep going for ages and ages, but it can't jump me off the floor very high. So if you think about when you watch people move, or maybe if you're doing testing with yourselves on your team, or you have a training partner, right? Who's the person who can vertical jump and touch the ceiling? And who's the person who can vertical jump and barely touch the top of the whiteboard? Because it depends on what kind of muscle you have. Okay? No one has completely one or the other, but we have a ratio.
You can train to make one more prominent than the other.
Not a lot.
Not like a sprinter. So a sprinter
A
is.
sprinter is a sprinter is a sprinter is born a sprinter. If you're not a sprinter, you are never going to be a sprinter. Doesn't matter how hard you train. Right? Because this ratio is genetic. So by the time we're born, most of our fibers have already decided whether they're fast or slow twitch. We get about a year for the final percentage of the fibers to make their decision whether they're going to be fast or slow twitch. And that's it. You're pretty much done. You can change it a little bit with training, but it's not enough to turn someone who's slow into someone who's fast. And it isn't enough to make someone who's fast a world-class marathon runner.
So your only chances within, can you change the fibers in the first year alone? That's your only chance to change?
That would be your only chance to have any kind of real
So you
impact.
just take
Yeah.
your baby
You
steps.
take a baby and move their legs really far.
Would that
Yeah,
work?
that's I don't know. That's a good question. I've not seen anything, but yeah.
So
So everybody has a slightly different variation of this ratio. On average, right, an average person is around 50-50. So I'm okay at running a mile, and I'm okay at jumping, but I'm not good at either one. Right? I can do them both, but I'm not going to be great at either of them. That's most of us on the planet.
if I can grab a rim, that means I have more
Fast twitch, yes. Right, so this is a key point, because when you look at these people who are really, really good at something, they are not average. There is nothing typical. They are freaky people with very odd ratios of muscle fibers. Right? So someone who can run a marathon in 2 hours and 10 minutes has a ridiculous amount of the slow, long-term muscle type. Right? Way more, like 80% of their muscles are slow.
So Usain Bolt's 80% is fast.
Usain Bolt.
Oh, yeah. He's probably 75, at least 75% fast twitch fiber, in his legs at least, right? That is not normal. It doesn't matter how hard you work, you can't run that far. It's not happening, right? Because you don't have the body to allow you to do that. So it's really interesting when we start looking at the ratio of muscle fiber and what happens to muscle fiber when we train. Because underlying, you have to remember that that is basically genetic. Again, I think it's an important idea to pay attention to if you're going to teach PE or you're going to coach, or even if you're going to personal train. Because you have to understand what someone's physiological limitation is. If I'm going to pick my track team, right, for our competition against the other high school in the next town, who do I have running my 100 meters and my 200 meters? Okay. And who do I have running my mile? Who do I have jumping? At some point, if you're working in a school, you might have to just go, well, this is not the best person for this job, but they need to have a role, right? I can't leave them sitting on the side. That's not okay. They've got to be able to engage. If I'm a pro coach and I'm getting paid a lot of money, right, when I was at Auburn, which was a long time ago now, but the head football coach was paid $1 million. And that was the payroll. That's without all the other benefits he got, right? So if I'm Auburn's head coach and I'm being paid, then I have to do all that pre-testing. I've got to have my recruits in and test them out because I need to know exactly what their physiological potential is. Because now my job depends on it. Different situation. I'm not going to put someone who is slow in a position where they have to run down the field as fast as possible and dodge people and try and catch the ball and keep up. That would be daft. So I have to know exactly what the potential, regardless of this, and we all know this plays a big role, right? I can have the best body in the world and not be a world champion, because there are other things that count. But I can't be a world champion just on what's going on in here. You have to have the backup. You've got to have at least a good body to work with. Okay. So, where are we here? All right. Muscle mass is pretty consistent until you hit around 50. So obviously the more I train when I'm younger, the more muscle mass I'm going to have. But muscle mass is pretty consistent. If I don't train, I don't lose all my muscle mass if I don't train. Right? We all know people who are relatively sedentary. They're all quite capable of standing up and walking across the bridge, right? They've got muscles. So muscle mass is pretty consistent until we hit about 50. At 50, it starts going downhill really rapidly. It's another reason why it's important that we have the habit of physical activity before we hit 50. Because you want to be able to maintain your muscle mass at a point when physiologically it's starting to deteriorate. If I'm going to maintain it, I have to keep stressing it. It means I've got to be exercising all the time. And it gets harder, right? It's totally unfair. We do all this work in our 20s and our 30s, and we're like, okay, I'm good to go. I've put in the foundation. No, when you hit 50, you have to work even harder if you want to maintain it. Right? No never gets easier. So by 80 on average, most people have lost around 30% of their muscle mass, and most of the muscle that you lose is the fast type. Right? Well, that makes sense. If you think about people who are older that you know, aren't they a little bit slower than they used to be? Right? Because we lose the really fast muscle as we get older. Do I have to lose 30% of my muscle mass? No, the research doesn't indicate that. It looks as though if I exercise regularly, I can keep a lot more. Am I going to lose muscle? Yes. Am I going to lose that much? No. So the key is I want to minimize the loss as much as I can, because how do I stay on balance? Okay, what do I need?
Center of gravity.
Center of gravity wants to be low. I've got to keep it within my base of support. Do I want my legs strong or wobbly? Strong, right? People who fall after the age of 70, actually after 65, people who fall and break a hip are at way bigger risk of not living out the rest of the year. Not because of the fall and the broken hip, but because of all the repercussions of that. So I don't want to fall. I need to keep my legs as strong as possible, but if I don't do anything, that's not going to happen. Right? If I just sit down and be sedentary, you are going to lose a ton of muscle mass. You've got to keep moving, you've got to keep stressing the system, you've got to stay as active as you can. So, type 2 fibers, they're the fast ones. It does seem that they tend to drop off more than the slower ones. So I might still be able to run, but I'm not going to be able to run as fast as I could before. Okay. We'll do that. Next bit. On Wednesday, pay attention this week, because Wednesday is the rest of chapter 5. Friday is your review session because you have an exam next week. Okay? So